Hey, I'm Patrick from Last Records, and today I'm diving into wingsuit deaths, a sport that, to me, sounds absolutely terrifying. And after researching these stories, I can definitely confirm it. From a climber attempting to fly through a stone arch he'd only ever practiced in virtual reality, to a retired military instructor wanting to take up the world's deadliest sport after retirement, which, believe me, ended his first flight in the most brutal way possible. It was September 14th, 2019, at a remote Dolomite formation in the Italian Alps, where a natural stone arch connected two vertical towers roughly 9,000 feet above sea level. The arch framed open sky on both sides, a gap approximately 40 feet wide and 25 feet tall. Below it, a scree field dropped several hundred feet into a glacial valley. Cassiel Montebruno was 29 years old and worked as a route setter at a climbing gym in Innsbruck, Austria. He had transitioned from sport climbing to base jumping 4 years earlier, a common pipeline in the Innsbruck climbing scene, and had progressed to wingsuit base over the previous 18 months, logging roughly 60 wingsuit flights from established alpine exits. Now, 60 wingsuit flights is not nothing. But for what he was about to attempt, it's not a lot either. He had identified the arch during a climbing trip the previous autumn and spent 2 months planning a wingsuit flight through the opening. His roommate later told investigators that Cassiel had taped a printed screenshot of the arch to his bathroom mirror and stood in front of it every morning with his arms extended, rehearsing the body adjustments he planned to make on approach. And here's where it gets interesting. He had also built a 3-dimensional model of the arch using photogrammetry software, feeding it photographs taken from several positions across the valley. He practiced the approach repeatedly in virtual reality. His roommate said he ran the simulation so many times he could walk through the sequence without looking at the screen. The bathroom mirror detail is what stuck with me when I was researching this one. 2 months, every single morning. This wasn't someone being reckless. This was someone who genuinely believed they had eliminated every variable. On the day of the flight, Cassiel hiked to the exit point with 2 friends, one as a ground cameraman in the valley below, the other at the exit to observe. Conditions were clear with minimal wind. He performed his gear check, confirmed radio contact, and walked to the edge. He exited cleanly. The friend at the exit watched Cassiel orient toward the arch, his body position stable through the initial seconds of flight. The opening grew rapidly as he closed the distance. His approach line was slightly high, entering the upper third of the gap rather than center. Now, from the research I did, being even slightly off on your line at this speed is a serious problem. Cassiel dropped his right shoulder to correct downward. The adjustment introduced lateral drift that had not been present in his original trajectory. His right wing panel closed the distance to the inner edge of the arch faster than the correction could stabilize. The wing clipped the rock at approximately 100 miles per hour. The friend at the exit point saw Cassiel's body fold against the interior edge of the arch and drop into the scree field below. The ground cameraman called emergency services immediately. A helicopter rescue team reached the site within 40 minutes. Cassiel was found in the upper scree field roughly 120 feet below the arch. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. So here's what came out of the investigation, and this is the part that really broke me. Now, here's what the investigation found. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic open thoracic trauma with bilateral flail chest, traumatic aortic rupture, and comminuted fractures of the right humerus, scapula, and clavicle. Investigators later examined the photogrammetry model Cassiel had used. The model estimated the gap at 46 feet, roughly 15% wider than the actual measurement. That discrepancy gave him a false margin. Combined with the lateral drift from his correction, his clearance dropped to less than 2 feet. The software developer issued no public statement, which personally I find infuriating. Cassiel's roommate took down the screenshot the following week. The toughest pill to swallow for me is, he did everything right, but the tool he trusted most was the one that failed him. Let's move on to the next one I came across. This one's about a wingsuit pilot and a gut-wrenching secret he was keeping from his girlfriend. It was June 15, 2017, and a wide alpine valley stretched below a granite ridgeline in central Idaho, where summer thermals rose steadily off sun-warmed rock faces throughout the morning. The valley floor, a mix of sagebrush, dry grass, and scattered pine, sat roughly 3,000 feet below the ridgeline exit point used by local wingsuit pilots. Cale Sundquist was 33 years old and worked as a wildland firefighter based out of Boise, Idaho, 9 seasons on a hotshot crew. Outside of fire season, he was an active wingsuit base jumper with over 300 flights logged across 5 years. His girlfriend, Elke Rennert, was 30 and a veterinary technician, also an experienced jumper with roughly 150 wingsuit flights. They had been together for 2 years, and I'll be honest, when I first came across this story, I almost didn't include it. It's going to be a tough pill to swallow, so buckle in. That morning, Cale had organized a 3-person formation wingsuit flight. Himself, Elke, and a mutual friend, acting as cameraman from a 3rd position. The plan was to fly in loose formation down the valley, deploy parachutes at altitude, and descend to a landing zone near a trailhead below. A heartbreaking discovery I found while researching this is that Cale had told only the cameraman about a second plan. He intended to propose to Elke under a canopy after deployment. He had a ring box secured with industrial-strength Velcro inside the chest pocket of his wingsuit. During the gear check, the cameraman later told investigators he watched Cale press the pocket flat, then peel it open, then press it flat again, 3 times in a few minutes. Elke later told investigators she noticed his hands moving around his chest repeatedly and assumed it was pre-jump nerves, which was unusual for someone she had seen exit cliffs dozens of times without hesitation. She was watching the signs of a proposal and thought of them as anxiety. That's the kind of detail that just stays with you. The 3 jumped in sequence. Kyle first, Elke 2 seconds behind, the cameraman a second after her. The cameraman later told investigators they established a loose parallel formation within the first 10 seconds, separated by roughly 25 feet at roughly 100 miles per hour. The planned formation called for maintaining that distance. Instead, Cale began closing the gap. The cameraman later described him drifting laterally toward Elke over roughly 6 seconds, a standard correction to tighten the frame, steady and deliberate, not erratic. At approximately 15 feet of separation, Cale's left leg wing overlapped Elke's right leg wing. The leg wings made contact, briefly catching against each other before both pilots lost stability. Both pilots pitched simultaneously. Elke tumbled right, Cale tumbled left. Elke later described several seconds of uncontrolled rotation before she stabilized, regained orientation, and deployed her parachute. Her canopy opened cleanly. She landed hard in the sagebrush roughly half a mile from the planned zone, sustaining a fractured ankle and lacerations. Kyle did not recover, and what comes next is the part I found hardest to write. The cameraman described him rotating on 2 axes, a flat spin compounded by a forward tumble. His body remained in continuous, uncontrolled rotation. No parachute deployment was observed by anyone present. He struck the valley floor at high speed. Recovery teams reached the site within 2 hours. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be extreme polytrauma, consistent with high-speed ground impact during wingsuit flight, including open skull fractures, complete disruption of the thoracic cavity, and bilateral femoral fractures. No deployment handle pull was initiated. Investigators concluded the multi-axis rotation likely produced spatial disorientation severe enough to prevent a deployment attempt. The ring box was recovered from his chest pocket, still secured under the Velcro flap. The ring inside was totally undamaged, and I'll be honest, I spent a long time just blankly staring at my screen when I found that out. Elke declined all media inquiries in the months that followed. The cameraman retained his recordings, but never released them. No memorial was placed at the site, per the family's request. If there's one story on this channel that I genuinely wish I didn't have to tell, it's this one. So this next story genuinely frustrated me when I was putting it together. This one involves a live stream and a cliff in Norway, which you can already tell is a recipe for disaster. It was August 12th, 2015, and late morning fog clung to the base of a fjordside cliff in western Norway, where a granite wall dropped nearly 3,000 feet from a flat alpine plateau to the valley floor below. A gravel path led from the road to a small clearing at the cliff's edge, a well-known wingsuit and base exit point. Meadow Tancredi was 24 years old and worked as a full-time content creator based in San Diego, California. She had built a following by documenting an accelerated progression through adventure sports, bungee jumping, indoor skydiving, tandem paragliding, and eventually sports skydiving. A wingsuit base jump had been a stated goal in several of her videos. Honestly, this story is the one that frustrated me the most out of most stories I've done on this channel, but I'll let you decide for yourself. She had traveled to Norway specifically for this jump, identifying the exit point through geotagged social media posts from other pilots. She had purchased her wingsuit and base container online from a US-based retailer 6 weeks earlier, submitting a jump log listing over 200 skydives as proof of experience. Investigators later verified her actual count at fewer than 80 jumps, with fewer than 20 solo freefall descents and 0 wingsuit flights of any kind. Let me say that again, 0 wingsuit flights, ever. Investigators later determined from recovered equipment and physical evidence at the exit point that Meadow had arrived at the clearing alone. She had adjusted the angle of her helmet-mounted camera 3 separate times and checked the viewer count on her live stream twice before walking to the edge. The arm wing zippers had not been closed before the jump, a standard pre-flight step experienced wingsuit pilots perform immediately before exit. She set her phone inside her pack near the edge, walked to the exit point, and stepped off. The live stream captured only a few seconds after exit. Viewers watching the stream later described her body collapsing almost immediately, shoulders hunching forward, legs dropping below her torso. She never achieved stable flight. Her trajectory angled sharply downward and toward the cliff face. Viewers described the image tilting violently, a blur of gray rock filling the frame, and the feed cutting to black. And I just want you to sit with that for a second. There were real people watching this happen, live on their screens. Several reported the stream sat frozen on a black screen for over a minute before the platform disconnected it. 2 base jumpers who arrived roughly 15 minutes later found her pack, phone, and personal effects at the clearing. They looked over the edge and called emergency services. From what I was able to find, a recovery team reached her body on a narrow ledge, approximately 200 feet below the exit point. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be massive craniofacial and cervical spine trauma consistent with a near-vertical impact against rock at high velocity. Investigators noted the complete absence of any stable flight phase. She never flew. From the moment she stepped off, she was falling. The live stream archive was removed by the platform within hours. Her logbook discrepancies prompted the retailer to implement third-party verification requirements for wingsuit and base equipment sales. The exit point in Norway remains in use. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, your viewer count or social media presence doesn't matter when you're standing on the edge of a 3,000-foot cliff. Okay, so this next one is wild to me. A guy spent 3 weeks mapping a canyon with his drone and still missed that one thing that mattered the most. It was March 22nd, 2018, and late winter light fell across a narrow sandstone corridor in a remote canyon system in southern Utah. Red-orange walls rose roughly 200 feet on either side, narrowing to less than 40 feet in places. The corridor floor, a dry wash littered with river cobble, sat in permanent shadow for most of the day. Brennick Solvaro was 31 years old and worked as a freelance drone videographer in Salt Lake City, Utah, shooting aerial footage for real estate firms, tourism boards, and outdoor media companies. He had picked up wingsuit base jumping 2 years earlier and logged approximately 80 flights from established desert cliff exits across the Southwest. His professional work had begun overlapping with his jumping. He scouted new proximity flight lines using his drones and sold the resulting wingsuit content to adventure media outlets. And here's where his process starts to look really impressive on paper. For this project, he had spent 3 weeks flying his drone through the corridor at varying altitudes, mapping the walls, overhangs, and constriction points on a tablet-based terrain model. Friends later told investigators he had mapped every contour from his drone surveys, but had never once hiked down into the canyon to see it from the ground. This was the detail jumped out at me immediately when I was researching this. They said he trusted what he saw on screens more than what he could see with his own feet. His planned flight line ran through the corridor at roughly 60 feet above the wash floor, threading the narrowest section where his surveys showed adequate clearance on both sides. He had flown the drone through at that altitude over a dozen times and was satisfied the line was clean. Now let me tell you how the morning played out. On the morning of the flight, Brennick hiked to the rim with a friend who planned to observe from the top. Conditions were clear. He performed his gear check, confirmed his line on the tablet one final time, and exited. His friend at the rim watched the entry, a clean exit, and stable flight into the corridor. The walls closed in on both sides as Brennick entered the narrow section. Then he disappeared from view below the rim line. His friend saw no parachute emerge from the far end of the corridor. He watched for several minutes, expecting Brennick to clear the narrows and deploy beyond the canyon mouth. When no canopy appeared, he called emergency services, but I can't imagine what that dreaded wait must have felt like. A search and rescue team reached the wash floor by late afternoon and found Brennick's body on the ground, roughly 60 feet below a steel cable spanning the width of the corridor. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be near-complete cervical transection with associated tracheal disruption and bilateral carotid and jugular lacerations. Death was instantaneous. The cable was later identified as a remnant of an early 20th century aerial ore tramway. Decades of oxidation had turned the steel the same rust orange as the surrounding sandstone, and its position fell within a shadow band cast by the eastern wall during afternoon hours, the same hours Brennick conducted his survey flights. In the drone footage he reviewed, the cable blended into the rock behind it and went unnoticed. 3 weeks of data, not visible in a single pass. The Land Management Agency removed the cable within weeks. If he had walked that canyon floor even once, he might have seen it. That's the part I can't let go of. All right, this next story is just baffling to me. He had 200 skydives on paper, and it still wasn't enough. It was August 8th, 2014, near a small operations building used by local guides at the base of a cliff in the Bernese Alps in central Switzerland. That summer, a group of experienced jumpers were running informal wingsuit-based training sessions at the site. The cliff above rose roughly 2,500 feet to a well-established exit point. Torsten Kalhofer was 46 years old and had recently stepped down as managing director of a financial technology startup in Munich, Germany, after selling his stake to a larger firm. The sale had been finalized 3 months earlier, and Torsten had spent the weeks since planning a series of milestone experiences. The wingsuit training was the centerpiece. He arrived on a Monday morning with a duffel bag, a new action camera still in its packaging, and a paid spot in the full cliff progression training for the week, the most expensive tier offered. Now, I've covered a lot of stories on this channel where money plays a role, but this might be one of the best examples of how it could go wrong. He had the minimum prerequisite on paper, 200 skydives. Now I want you to hold on to and remember that number. The investigation later revealed most of those jumps involved static line training with very limited solo freefall experience. This meant his verified solo experience was negligible. He had already tipped the lead guide 300 euros before the first session. Another student later told investigators Torsten mentioned he'd cleared his entire August and planned to screen the jump at a farewell dinner in September. The training ran several days before any cliff exit, starting with instruction and harness drills. Instructors noted Torsten struggled to maintain symmetry. His hips dropped to one side, and his legs separated unevenly under load. On the morning of the 5th day, the lead guide recommended an additional day of platform work. Torsten pushed back, citing his jump count and the package he'd purchased. And honestly, reading that had me worried, since I thought they weren't enforcing the rules and boundaries as strictly as they should have. A second instructor noted marginal improvement on the final drill set, and the two agreed to allow a single jump attempt while they observed from behind. Torsten hiked to the exit point with 2 instructors and 1 other student. The lead guide reviewed the plan one final time. Exit, maintain arch, fly straight, pull at altitude. Torsten acknowledged each step. He stepped off the cliff and immediately lost symmetry. The trailing instructor later told investigators he watched Torsten's legs drop within 2 seconds of exit, the left extending farther than the right, exactly the asymmetry documented during harness drills. The uneven drag initiated a rotation. Within 4 seconds, it tightened into a flat spin, his body revolving rapidly on a horizontal axis with limbs spread asymmetrically. The trailing instructor said the spin was fully developed before Torsten cleared the first 200 feet of altitude loss. No corrective input was visible. No deployment attempt was observed. The spin continued until he struck a steep talus slope approximately 800 feet below the exit point. Now let me tell you what came out of the aftermath. The guide team reached the site within 30 minutes. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be high-velocity blunt polytrauma with extensive cranial, spinal, thoracic, and pelvic fractures. Toxicology was negative. No equipment malfunction was identified. Everything worked. The screening didn't. The group running the training suspended jumps at the site for 2 weeks. When activity resumed, they began requiring verified solo freefall experience rather than relying on total jump count alone. The action camera Torsten brought was returned to his family unopened, still sealed. And that last detail is the one I keep coming back to. The brand new camera he bought, he never even got to press record on. All right, this last story is the one I keep coming back to. It's about 3,000 jumps, a 26-year military career, and one moment where none of it mattered. It was October 3rd, 2016, when a group of experienced wingsuit pilots gathered at a granite cliff exit point in the French Alps for what had become a regular autumn jumping session. The forested valley below stretched deep between steep walls of spruce and larch, and the cliff face dropped roughly 2,000 feet from the clearing's edge. Declan Morrow was 54 years old and had retired 2 years earlier after a 26-year career as an airborne instructor in the United States Army, based at a post in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Over his military service and subsequent sport jumping, he had logged over 3,000 parachute jumps, including static line, free fall, and tactical military jumps. So while reading this and seeing how much airtime he's had throughout his career, I thought to myself, how could this possibly have gone wrong? Well, let me tell you exactly how. After retirement, he had taken up wingsuit-based jumping, completing a course, purchasing his own suit, and jumping regularly at alpine sites during annual trips. In 2 years, he had accumulated roughly 40 wingsuit flights, 3,000 parachute jumps, but only 40 in a wingsuit. I think that gap is important to understand. According to an article I read, his wife told investigators she had expressed concern about the transition, that the suits were different from anything he had jumped before. She said he told her he had more time under canopy than most people had walking, and that she recognized the tone immediately. It was the same voice he used when he had already made up his mind. He carried a laminated photograph of a former jump partner killed in a training accident 20 years earlier inside the liner of his helmet. His wife said he touched it before every exit, pressing his fingers against the padding the way a pilot runs through a pre-flight check. A local jumper at the exit that morning confirmed seeing Declan hold the helmet against his chest before putting it on. That detail alone tells you everything you need to know about this man. Declan exited cleanly. A local pilot who had jumped 30 seconds ahead and was already under canopy in the valley below later described the flight line as textbook. stable position, smooth glide, clean trajectory away from the wall. The local pilot saw Declan's arm begin the deployment reach. He described the motion as slower than expected. The arm extended, paused briefly, then continued. The delay between the initiation of the pull and the visible release of the pilot chute was longer than the observer had seen from experienced jumpers at that site. The canopy emerged from the container and began to inflate, but the altitude lost during the delayed deployment had carried Declan below the margin needed for a full opening above the tree line. The observer watched the canopy spread to roughly half inflation, fabric catching air, beginning to arc into shape, before Declan's descent carried him into the top of the spruce canopy. The partially open canopy dragged through the upper branches behind him. The local pilot watched from several hundred yards away. He landed immediately and began hiking toward the tree line while calling emergency services. A mountain rescue team reached the site within 90 minutes. Declan was found suspended roughly 30 feet above the ground, his partially inflated canopy snagged in the upper branches. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene, and what they found afterwards is why I saved this story for last. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe blunt force trauma to the head and thorax, including bilateral rib fractures, pulmonary contusions, a depressed skull fracture, and traumatic cervical spine dislocation. The injury pattern was consistent with a partially decelerated descent into dense tree cover. Less kinetic energy than an unimpeded ground strike, but enough to be fatal at the speed of entry. Equipment analysis confirmed the deployment system functioned correctly. No defects. The container opened as designed. The delay was entirely human. Investigators noted that wingsuit arm wings impose significant resistance on the deployment motion, slowing the reach required to release the pilot chute. Everything worked. He just wasn't fast enough, and that part just breaks me. His wife received the helmet the following week. The photograph was still inside the liner, exactly where he had placed it that morning.